The late 1970s in northern England was a period defined by a specific atmospheric weight. It was an era of industrial twilight, where the great textile mills of Yorkshire were beginning to fall silent, and the terraced streets of Leeds and Bradford were often shrouded in the smoke of coal fires and the damp fog of the Pennines. But amidst the economic uncertainty and the shifting social tides, a different kind of darkness began to take hold. It was a darkness that would change the social fabric of the United Kingdom forever, altering how women lived their lives, how the police conducted investigations, and how the public understood the nature of evil. For 5 long years, between 1975 and 1980, the counties of West Yorkshire and Greater Manchester were held in a grip of terror by a predator who seemed to operate with impunity. He became known in the press and the public consciousness as the Yorkshire Ripper. But behind the sensational headlines and the fear that emptied the streets after dark, there is a complex story of a massive, overwhelmed police investigation, a tragic misunderstanding of forensic science, and a catastrophic series of missed opportunities. This is not a story that glorifies the perpetrator. Rather, it is an examination of the systemic failures that allowed him to evade capture, the resilience of a community under siege, and the eventual triumph of routine policing that brought Peter Sutcliffe to justice. To understand the impact of these crimes, one must first understand the setting. In 1975, Leeds was a bustling city, but like many urban centers of the time, it had its shadows. The first known murder attributed to this investigation occurred in October of that year. Wilma McCann was a young mother, a woman with a complex life, whose body was discovered in the Prince Philip playing fields. The violence inflicted upon her was extreme, indicating a perpetrator driven by a deep-seated rage. However, the initial investigation was hampered by the social prejudices of the time. Because the victim was found in an area associated with sex work, the police focus narrowed almost immediately. This tunnel vision would become a recurring theme in the investigation, a fatal flaw that assumed the killer was only targeting a specific demographic of women. This assumption was tragically incorrect. As the months turned into years, the victim profile expanded, proving that no woman was safe. In January 1976, Emily Jackson was taken. The brutality of the attack mirrored the first, establishing a clear pattern for forensic pathologists. The killer used blunt force trauma as a primary method of incapacitation, followed by the use of sharp implements. The consistency of the wounds provided the first real link between the crimes, confirming that a serial offender was at work. Yet, the police force, then known as the West Yorkshire Metropolitan Police, was facing an unprecedented challenge. We must remember that this was an era before DNA profiling, before digital databases, and before closed-circuit television cameras monitored every street corner. Policing was an analog profession. Information was recorded on index cards, filed manually in massive organizing cabinets. As the list of suspects grew, so did the paperwork. The major incident room became a sea of paper. Officers were dealing with hundreds of thousands of handwritten notes, vehicle registration numbers, and witness statements. The sheer volume of data became a hindrance rather than a help. Without a computerized system to cross-reference information, vital clues were buried under the weight of administration. By 1977, the attacks had escalated. The murder of Jane MacDonald, a 16-year-old shop assistant, sent shockwaves through the country. Jane did not fit the police's established profile of the victims. Her death shattered the misconception that the killer was only targeting women involved in the sex trade. The public realization that any woman, anywhere, could be a target caused a shift in the cultural atmosphere. A gloom descended over the North. Women were advised not to go out alone at night. The Reclaim the Night movement was born out of this fear and anger, as women marched to demand their right to safety in public spaces. As the body count rose, the pressure on the police became unbearable. The investigation, led by Assistant Chief Constable George Oldfield, was the largest in British history. They were desperate for a breakthrough, and in their desperation, they fell victim to one of the most devastating hoaxes in criminal history. In 1978 and 1979, the police received 3 letters and a cassette tape. The letters were taunting, mocking the police for their inability to catch the killer. The tape contained a voice, a calm, chilling male voice with a distinct Geordie accent, originating from the Sunderland area of Wearside. The voice claimed to be the Ripper. Top linguistic experts analyzed the recording and pinpointed the speaker's origin to a specific village. Convinced this was their man, the police leadership pivoted the entire investigation to focus on men with Geordie accents. This decision was catastrophic. The real killer, Peter Sutcliffe, was a local man from Bradford. He had a broad Yorkshire accent, not a Geordie one. Because of the fixation on the tape, suspects who did not sound like the man on the recording were disregarded. Peter Sutcliffe was interviewed by the police 9 separate times during the course of the investigation. He was overlooked every single time, partly because his voice did not match the tape. The Wearside Jack hoax, as it came to be known, provided the killer with an accidental cloak of invisibility, allowing him to continue his attacks while the police chased a ghost in the wrong part of the country. The tragedy of the investigation is compounded by the fact that the clues were there. Forensic evidence, though primitive by today's standards, was accumulating. Tire tracks found at several crime scenes belonged to a specific brand of tire. Boot prints were identified. Survivors of the attacks, women who had miraculously escaped with their lives, provided descriptions of a man with dark hair and a beard. But the composite sketches varied, and the overwhelming focus on the Geordie accent caused detectives to discount witness testimony that pointed to a local Yorkshireman. It is important to analyze the psychological profile of the offender, Peter Sutcliffe, to understand how he evaded detection. He was not a criminal mastermind. He was a lorry driver, a man described by those who knew him as quiet and unassuming. He was married and lived a seemingly mundane life in a detached house in Bradford. This banality was his greatest camouflage. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a neighbor. He worked regular hours, had friends, and visited local pubs. This ability to compartmentalize, to separate his domestic life from his violent nocturnal activities, is a common trait among serial predators, making them incredibly difficult to identify without concrete forensic links. The breakthrough, when it finally came in January 1981, was not the result of the massive manhunt, the millions of pounds spent, or the elaborate profiling. It was the result of instinctive, routine police work. In the city of Sheffield, South Yorkshire, an area outside the primary investigation zone, 2 police officers, Sergeant Ring and probationary constable Hides, were on a routine patrol. They spotted a rover parked in a driveway with a man and a woman inside. The situation seemed slightly out of place, so they decided to run a check on the vehicle's license plates. The check revealed that the plates did not match the vehicle. It was a minor offense, a discrepancy that could have been easily explained away or resulted in a simple ticket. But the officers decided to investigate further. They arrested the driver and took him to the police station. The man identified himself as Peter Sutcliffe. At the scene, before being taken away, he had asked to relieve himself behind an oil tank. It was only later, when officers returned to the scene to search for evidence, that they found a hammer and a knife hidden behind that tank. Back at the station, the pieces began to fall into place. Sutcliffe matched the physical description given by survivors. He owned a car that matched the tire tracks found at crime scenes. And significantly, he did not have a Geordie accent. As the questioning intensified, the facade of the quiet lorry driver crumbled. The police realized they had not just caught a car thief. They had caught the most wanted man in Britain. The interrogation of Peter Sutcliffe revealed a disturbed mind, but it also closed the book on years of speculation. He confessed to the crimes, describing the attacks with a detachment that chilled the seasoned detectives in the room. He claimed that he was on a mission from God, a voice he heard while working in a graveyard years prior. This claim would become the central point of contention during his trial. The trial of Peter Sutcliffe began in May 1981 at the Old Bailey in London. The location was chosen to ensure a fair trial, as the emotions in Yorkshire ran too high. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere tense. The prosecution charged him with 13 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. The defense argued for a plea of diminished responsibility, citing paranoid schizophrenia. They presented the narrative that Sutcliffe was driven by hallucinations and commanded by a divine voice to eliminate women he perceived as immoral. 3 forensic psychiatrists for the defense supported this diagnosis. Even the prosecution initially seemed willing to accept a plea of manslaughter due to diminished responsibility. However, the judge, Mr. Justice Borum, demanded that the case be put before a jury. He insisted that the question of Sutcliffe's sanity and intent was a matter for the public to decide through their peers. The trial became a battle between the diagnosis of mental illness and the assertion of calculated evil. The prosecution, led by the Attorney General, dismantled the divine mission defense. They pointed to the premeditation involved in the attacks. Sutcliffe had used false license plates, the very thing that got him caught, to conceal his identity during his crimes. He had hidden his weapons. He had fled scenes when interrupted. These were the actions of a man who knew what he was doing was wrong and who was actively trying to avoid capture. The prosecution argued that his claims of hearing voices were a fabrication, a convenient story constructed to avoid a life sentence in a maximum security prison. After a trial lasting 2 weeks, the jury retired to consider their verdict. It took them nearly 6 hours to reach a decision. They rejected the plea of diminished responsibility. They found Peter Sutcliffe guilty of murder on all 13 counts. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment, with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 30 years. He described Sutcliffe as an unusually dangerous individual, beyond the reach of rehabilitation. The verdict brought a sense of closure, but it also sparked a massive inquiry into the police handling of the case. The Byford Report, commissioned shortly after the trial, was a scathing review of the investigation. It highlighted the systemic failures, the lack of computerization, the rigid hierarchical structure that discouraged junior officers from challenging their superiors, and the catastrophic fixation on the Wearside Jack tape. The legacy of the Yorkshire Ripper case is profound. It revolutionized British policing. The Byford Report led to the development of the Holmes system, the Home Office Large Major Inquiry System. This computer database was designed to cross-reference clues, statements, and suspects across different police forces, ensuring that data overload would never again allow a serial killer to slip through the net. It forced a change in how police viewed victims, moving away from judgment of their lifestyles toward a focus on the crime itself. Furthermore, the case left a deep scar on the communities of West Yorkshire. The fear that ruled those 5 years changed the way a generation of women interacted with their environment. The Reclaim the Night marches that began during the investigation continue to this day, a testament to the enduring fight for women's safety. Peter Sutcliffe spent the rest of his life in custody, first in high-security psychiatric hospitals, and later in prison, dying in 2020. But the story should not end with his name. The true focus must remain on the 13 women who lost their lives. Wilma McCann, Emily Jackson, Irene Richardson, Patricia Atkinson, Jane MacDonald, Jean Jordan, Yvonne Pearson, Helen Ritka, Vera Millward, Josephine Whitaker, Barbara Leach, Marguerite Walls, and Jacqueline Hill. They were students, mothers, daughters, and workers. Their lives were cut short, and their potential stolen. And we must remember the survivors, the women who lived with the physical and psychological scars of their encounters. Their testimony, often ignored at the time, was vindicated in the end. The case of the Yorkshire Ripper serves as a grim milestone in criminal history. It reminds us of the dangers of tunnel vision and confirmation bias in investigations. It highlights the absolute necessity of objective forensic science. But perhaps most importantly, it forces us to look at how society protects its most vulnerable members. As we reflect on the technological advancements that have made it harder for such a predator to operate today. DNA profiling, Ubiquitous surveillance? Digital tracking? We must ask ourselves a difficult question. While technology has improved the odds of catching a killer, has the fundamental safety of our streets truly changed? The tools of justice have evolved, but the need for vigilance, community awareness, and the protection of all citizens, regardless of their background, remains as critical today as it was in the fog-bound streets of 1975. Justice was eventually served, but the lessons learned came at a terrible price, paid for by the lives of innocent women and the innocence of a community.